Chapter 18. So you're not happy about your aunt? It was the afternoon following the dinner party at Place Wernlas. Martin James was sitting in a coracle, a frail-looking elliptical, tar-covered boat in the middle of a river. Merlin Griffiths, the solicitor, was in a similar one-man craft nearby and guided them towards the centre of the river, demonstrating to Martin how to use the single paddle as they went. It was a difficult thing to manage, and Martin copied the younger man's movements as best he could as they moved away from the bank. The river was clear and deep, and in its centre there was a strong breeze. "That is what you came to see me about?" "Yes, of course." After Simon Merriam's outburst the previous night and Queenie's reply, Martin had not been able to sleep. He'd gone back to reading the cut-ins that Merlin Griffiths had sent him, part of which included sections from his dead aunt's diary. The involved history of Place Wernlas and the complications surrounded Parker Merriam's death compelled him to find a clarity if he could. So he'd phoned the solicitor earlier on the Saturday morning and had accepted his invitation to go out in a coracle with him. Now, in the middle of a strange river, in an unstable craft, he was beginning to wonder whether his decision had been a wise one. But they had avoided the main current and were floating gently in the calmer centre of the river. "I don't know there is a but," Martin said, looking upstream to where an arched stone bridge spanned the river and led to a road which in turn bordered a series of carefully kept green fields. The coracle bobbed gently beneath him. "Pass me the rod, will you?" Martin Griffiths said. "I left it in your coracle by mistake." Martin picked up the short fishing rod with his free hand, trying not to upset the fragile equilibrium of the craft while he did so. He handed it to the solicitor, who, dressed in t-shirt, jeans, and a compulsory life jacket, seemed even younger than he'd been when Martin saw him for the first time in his office. Younger, but sitting in the modern equivalent of a 1,000-year-old skin boat, he seemed even more securely connected to his environment than ever. "Special license," Merlin Griffiths explained, fitting a fly to a hook and casting with a fluid motion. "There's a waiting list." "Why do you think my aunt's murderer was never found?" Martin said suddenly. "Could be a number of reasons," Merlin Griffiths replied. "I've always been fascinated by the place myself. My friend Fionn Roberts did a special study on Georgian houses in West Wales. She thinks it's the most interesting one." "My aunt's murder," Martin said. "And what kind of reasons?" "Some of them could have been procedural." "I don't understand." "It was obvious that Myrick Evans, who's in charge of the case, was desperate for conviction. That's why he picked on William Davis." "Why choose a deaf man?" "Someone couldn't fight back, perhaps." "Deeper question is, why did he need a conviction so badly?" "Have you asked your father?" It seemed a simple enough question at first, but almost as soon as it was out of his mouth, Martin James knew that there was more to it. Merlin Griffiths didn't reply, and concentrating on paddling his coracle, trying to keep it in the centre of the river. Martin did his best to follow suit. There was something about the current that seemed to be pushing them downstream with a twisting motion. "Try and keep your paddle in tight," Merlin Griffiths said. "I'm not an expert either. Don't get out here as often as I'd like. It's my father's idea to support the trust and keep his whole thing going." "But you're not that close to him?" "Yes and no. He's my father. You know who it is." Martin James didn't know exactly how it was, since his own father had died when he was 5. But if his relationship with his Uncle Paul was any guide, he could more than guess. So, you don't feel you could ask him directly? He was the defending solicitor, wasn't he? He prepared the brief for Roland T. Hughes, the barrister, yes. Who's dead? What are you getting at, Martin? I don't know, Martin said. As I told you on the phone, there's something about it all that disturbs me. Like what? If I knew that exactly, I might feel better. Martin looked across to the young solicitor, who had now put down his rod and was once again concentrating on paddling. Martin followed his movements as best he could, and he could feel the river tugging against the coracle. Is anything the matter? He said. There's a waterfall, or waterfalls, Merlin Griffiths began. Downstream. Just then, something that sounded like a crack rang out, and there was a shout, and Merlin Griffiths lurched forward and dropped his paddle and clutched his arm, and his coracle began to move downstream more quickly. Martin tried to reach over and grab the other boat, but his own coracle lurched suddenly and threatened to capsize. Stay still, Merlin Griffiths called out. He let his paddle drop and was holding his arm as if he was injured. Now reach out and try and pull me towards you. Martin tried to do as Merlin Griffiths suggested, but the current was already beginning to pull the two coracles apart. Can you paddle? Martin nodded and tried his best with his free arm, but his coracle pulled away from the other and began to go round in a circle and then drift inevitably downstream. Not that way. Try and keep your paddle strokes even. What happened? Martin said. He was managing to slow the coracle's drift, but he knew he wasn't in control. Shot, Merlin Griffiths said. He looked pale. Is it serious? Can't tell. Paddle. But keeping control of the fragile, drifting craft was much more difficult than Martin had anticipated. And they were still moving downstream towards the falls. Try and keep it steady. Merlin Griffiths was doing his best to steer his own boat with his free arm. He wasn't having much success. Martin reached out again to grab the other boat, but it already moved too far away. Hold on! There was a shout from the bank where they'd launched the coracles 15 or so minutes ago. A stocky man with a flat hat got into a rowing boat and pushed off. Now, Martin James could hear the roar of falling water. He could see a couple on the far bank gesticulating as the coracles began to move dangerously downstream towards the waterfall. Take it! A thin line snaked across the coracle, and Martin dropped his paddle for a moment to pick it up. Pull! The man in the flat hat drew nearer in the rowing boat. Martin did as he suggested and hauled on the thin line, which was tied to a thicker one, which drew him towards Merlin Griffiths and the other coracle, into which he eventually collided. Tie it on! The inevitable drift towards the thundering water downstream stopped when Martin tied the thicker section of the rope to the board which straddled the middle of the coracle. When he'd finished, he reached over and pulled the other craft towards his. Merlin Griffiths sat there pale and shivering as the rowing boat began to pull them towards the bank. Good job your father can't see you now, the man in the flat hat said to Merlin Griffiths as he towed them in. What happened? Shot, Merlin Griffiths managed. In the arm. He took his right hand away to reveal a spreading red stain on his upper left arm. We'd better get you to the hospital, boy, Flathead said as they reached the bank. Stay here while I phone for an ambulance. I'll take him, Martin James said, helping Merlin up the bank. I've got my Land Rover. Know where it is? Merlin does, Martin said. He didn't want to waste any time. Come into the hut, Flathead said, pointing in the direction of a small wooden building with a flat roof. I'll put an emergency dressing on him first. Can't have a solicitor bleeding all over the place, can we? Martin then asked Merlin Griffiths if he was all right, and the solicitor said that he was, and then they followed the man in the flat hat into the West Wales Coracle Trust building.